Thank you. Well, what a thrill to find this big crowd in my adopted hometown of Kansas City. Karen and I have lived here for 5.5 years now, and I must say, when we moved here, even though I grew up just on the other side of the Big Empty, as I call it, in Denver, Colorado, and made that long trip across I-70 several times in my youth, I didn't really know what to expect from Kansas City when we moved here from Washington, D.C. And I must say I've been overwhelmed by the welcome and support and fun times that we've had in this beautiful city. And this is another addition to the great memories that I'm collecting in this place that has become home. I want to thank Crosby, Kemper, and Henry Fortunato for inviting me to do this. My friends at the Truman Library, Mike and Alex, friend to be, Mary, my friend as of tonight, at the great Truman Library. I often think, especially after visiting a couple of times over at the museum in Independence, and seeing compressed into those first years of the Truman administration, the astonishing world-changing events that this man from Jackson County presided over. I think in many ways he is the 20th century version of the man I want to talk about tonight, Abraham Lincoln. And Charles Sumner, near the beginning of 1862, the great abolitionist and Massachusetts senator, said, "Never in history has so much been all compressed into so little time." And Harry Truman had that same experience and was equally underestimated and, like Lincoln, rose to greatness in the office. I want to talk a little bit tonight about this year, 1862, and about this strange man, Abraham Lincoln. I hope I don't offend anyone by calling arguably our greatest president a strange man, but that's the word he used for himself. He was the first one to say. In one of his earliest little bits of autobiography, he described himself as a strange, friendless, penniless boy when he emerged from the frontier and began his life in Illinois. And when he reached Washington, D.C., he was equally strange to the people who met him there. It began with the physical appearance of Lincoln, a very oddly put together piece of a person. He seemed to be made up of pieces borrowed from other human beings. His torso, actually, we all know that he's our tallest president at about my height, 6'4". But his torso was the size of a normal man of his time, more like 5'9". It was these extraordinarily long legs that he had, and equally long arms that dangled, huge hands and feet. His nickname among people who didn't like him in Washington, and there were an awful lot of them, was the gorilla. Or as Edwin Stanton called him when he met him in the 1850s. Stanton, of course, became one of Lincoln's greatest admirers and supporters. It was Stanton who said at Lincoln's deathbed, "Now he belongs to the ages." But when Stanton first met him in the 1850s, when they were lawyers together on a patent case in Chicago, he called him that damned long-armed ape. They didn't really know what to make of him in Washington. His Secretary of State, William Seward, at the beginning of the Lincoln administration, was nice enough to offer to essentially take over the presidency for Lincoln. It was obvious that he was overmatched and not up to the job. Lincoln declined to give Seward that job. But in those first months of the Civil War, everything about the United States changed almost overnight. The scale of the transformation of the federal government between April of 1861 and December of, or January, New Year's Day, 1862, where my book begins, is simply mind-boggling. The entire budget for the presidential executive staff when Abraham Lincoln came to Washington was one employee. He was allowed to hire a secretary. He immediately knew he'd need at least two secretaries, so he stashed one on the Interior Department payroll until he could get a supplemental appropriation for John Hay's salary. The entire federal budget was about $70 million. That had been the appropriation for 1861 fiscal year when Congress, the last Congress before secession, had met. By the beginning of 1862, the federal government was spending $70 million every week, 50 times. We worry about the growth of the federal government now. I mean, 50 times bigger is frightening to contemplate. The Union Army, at the beginning of Lincoln's presidency, numbered about 16,000 troops spread out all across the continent, most of them out in the West in little garrisons of 50 or 100 or 200 men keeping the peace here or there. At the outset of the war, there was no one in the Union Army, or the United States Army, under the age of 60 who had ever led more than 1,000 troops in battle. The men who were being called on to command the enormous overnight volunteer army being created to put down the rebellion in the South, these men, their combat experience was as 20-year-olds, young West Point graduates in the Mexican-American War 15 years earlier. They had been lieutenants leading companies of a few dozen men, perhaps. This was their experience. In October of 1861, one of those men who had had a very, very good tour in the Mexican War had been promoted to captain based on his success. Very promising young officer who had left the army and gone into private life, had been brought back to help train these troops that were being raised, the volunteers in Illinois. He had been offered the command of a regiment, which is 1,000 men. And he wrote in a letter, "I don't think there are many men on this continent who are qualified to lead 1,000 men, and I'm sure I'm not one of them." That was Ulysses Grant, who by February of 1862 was leading 17,000 men, and by April was in command of 50,000 men, and by the end of the year was in command of 100,000 troops. This army of 16,000 in April of 1861, by the end of 1861, had grown to some 250,000 troops spread across the line from Washington, from the Washington area out here to St. Louis. Who was going to lead these troops? And people looked at this strange figure, this ungainly ape of a president whose entire executive experience was as senior partner in a two-man law firm in Springfield, Illinois, a two-man law firm that the junior partner actually ran from day to day. They looked at him and they felt he was entirely out of his depth. Nothing illustrates this better than the meeting that was held at the White House on New Year's Eve, in the last hours of 1861 as 1862 was about to begin. Congress, which had been out for most of the year, had reconvened at the beginning of December. One of the first things they did was to look around at this wreck that the Lincoln administration was making of the war. Armies were stalled all across the Union line. Nothing was moving, nothing seemed to be happening. The War Department was a corrupt shambles. So Congress appointed an oversight committee, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And the members of the committee had asked for a meeting with Lincoln and his cabinet, and now it was happening on New Year's Eve. For over 90 minutes, the Congressional Committee interrogated Lincoln. And the more questions they asked, the clearer it became that Abraham Lincoln really had no idea what this Union Army was planning. The commander of the armies, the general-in-chief, a 34-year-old named George McClellan, another one of these Mexican-American veterans who had gone into private life and had been called back, a former captain like Grant. The only thing he and Grant did not have in common was that McClellan had no doubt that he was qualified to command any number of troops that could be raised. McClellan had completely frozen Lincoln out of his plans, and worse, McClellan was suffering from typhoid fever, and the rumor that night around Washington was that he was dying, and that whatever plans he was cooking up were about to die with him. This shocking revelation of the lack of knowledge on the part of the commander-in-chief was so demoralizing that everybody left in a funk. The Attorney General, Edward Bates, a lawyer from St. Louis, went home and sat up into the night writing page after page in his diary, trying to get it all down. The rudderlessness, the fecklessness. He finally sums up his conclusions about Abraham Lincoln. He says he seems to be a man of character, honest, in the main wise. I like that little caveat, in the main wise. But he lacks force and will and has not the power to command. This was Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of 1862. And what unfolded over the next 12 months was what I call America's most perilous year, the hinge of American history, the year when the Confederacy came closest to winning its independence and breaking up the United States. It was a year of tremendous personal struggle for Lincoln. His favorite son, Willie, died of typhoid fever at age 11 in February. His wife suffered a nervous breakdown from the grief, locked herself in her room for over a month, didn't come out. His youngest son had lost his best friend and playmate and now was basically alone in Washington, D.C. And Lincoln was the only person who could provide love and care for Tad. The grief overwhelmed him for the entire year. And what else was going on in this year? This was the year that the Civil War became a cataclysm. No one, as Lincoln said in his great second inaugural address, no one at the beginning of the war imagined what it was going to be. On both sides, people believed there would be some kind of easy resolution, some quick victory. Either the Europeans would intervene on the side of the Confederacy and force a resolution, or on the North they believed that there'd be a victory or two by this great Union Army that had been raised, this mass of stout volunteers, and the people of the South would come to their senses and realize they had much more to gain by staying in the Union than by breaking it up. No one imagined until the first weekend of April 1862 at a steamboat landing in southern Tennessee near the Mississippi border by a little church called Shiloh. In 2 days, April 6th and 7th, Saturday and Sunday, there was a battle at Shiloh that left more Americans dead than had died in all of the nation's wars put together up to that point. This was carnage on a scale that Americans had never seen or imagined. And then just a few weeks after that, in the 7 days battles outside Richmond, it happened again. Thousands of young men killed and maimed. In a single 90 minutes or so on the afternoon of July 3rd at Malvern Hill, outside Richmond, I believe it's 3,000 Confederate troops killed in a hopeless assault on a Union artillery position. It happened again at the Second Battle of Bull Run at the end of August, and it happened again, as Crosby noted, on September 17th in western Maryland at Antietam Creek. In a single day, more Americans killed than on any other day in our history, all the way up to today. 23,000 men dead, wounded, and missing in the Battle of Antietam. And even then, the Battle of Perryville, called the most confused and desperate 3 hours of the war by some. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December, the reverse image of Malvern Hill. This time it was Union troops in a hopeless assault on a Confederate position. And as the year ended on New Year's Eve 1862 at Murfreesboro in central Tennessee, the battle that cost the Union Army the highest percentage losses of the entire war. A third of the Union Army lost in what became a victory at Stones River. So, through this whole year, Lincoln was wrestling with the competing demands of conservatives who wanted him to move carefully, who sought some kind of negotiated, peaceful end to the war. And on the other side, the abolitionists who were constantly pressing him to make the war a true war against slavery. He said at the beginning of the year that if I can just hold the North together, we can win. But holding the North together was a tremendous battle for this man. Remember, Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1862 with the smallest percentage of the popular vote in our history. He was, in that sense, the least popular president at the start of his administration that we've ever had. More than 6 out of 10 Americans voted against him. He got 37% of the vote. But how was he to hold this union together? He compared himself at one point during 1862 to a man crossing Niagara Falls on a tightrope, where one false step in either direction would plunge him into the abyss. And all the while, he said, there are people on the other shore yelling, "Take a step to the right, a step to the left." Why couldn't they just understand that he had all the hopes and dreams of the United States on his back, and that it would all go with him? somehow I know that many of us were taught in school that the outcome of the Civil War really was an inevitability. The North had so many more men, so many more railroads, so many more factories, so many more farms, so many more crops. That's not how it looked at the beginning of 1862. The most experienced statesmen in the world were convinced that the North would not win this fight. Lord Palmerston, the 77-year-old Prime Minister of Great Britain, having spent 50 years at the top of the most powerful government in the world, he informed his foreign ministry that it was his judgment that almost inevitably the North would fail to subdue the South. Why was that? Well, first, the real estate involved. The Confederacy was larger than the entire European continent conquered by Napoleon. What's more, it was almost impenetrable in so many ways. There were only a couple of railroads that ran from the north to the south. There were virtually no highways. It was all dirt roads, sandy in the summer, muddy in the winter. Fortunately for the North, there were rivers like the Mississippi, the Tennessee, and the Cumberland that Grant exploited in his great Fort Donelson campaign that Crosby talked about. But the South was also tremendously wealthy in very important ways. They had a near monopoly, a virtual monopoly on the world's most valuable commodity in 1860s, cotton. The Industrial Revolution in Europe was being driven by the textile industry, and the textile industry was hungry, starving for cotton. The South was convinced that by cutting off the supply of cotton to England and France, they could force the Europeans to intervene in this matter and demand a settlement that would recognize Southern independence. The task seemed almost impossible even to many people in the United States, in the North. And what they were quite sure of at the beginning of 1862 was that if somebody was going to be able to master this situation, it was not going to be this frontier lawyer, this elected character. They'd all studied their history, and they knew that all the elected republics in history that had come into great crises like this, they had all been forced to turn to a military dictator. Rome had to turn to Caesar. France turned to Napoleon. They were convinced that there would have to be a military coup, a dictator of some sort, set up above Lincoln, over Lincoln, in order to get the kind of things done that would be necessary to win this war and defeat this enemy. Some thought it would be McClellan. They spent all year whispering in McClellan's ear, telling him to turn his army around and take it to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Folks out here in Missouri thought it might be John Fremont, who was known to be negotiating and discussing and planning his own little empire west of the Mississippi. But whoever it wasn't going to be Abraham Lincoln. And yet, by the time the calendar had come all the way around, And New Year's Day, 1863 arrived. Lincoln had command of the military. He had relieved McClellan. He had successfully kept the Europeans out of the war. The great southern invasion of the North that took place in September and October of 1862 had failed. The elections of 1862 had passed and Lincoln's Republican Party was still in power. And most importantly, Lincoln, on New Year's Day, 1863, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It changed the face of the war and the future of the country. Took the first steps toward the new birth of freedom that he would speak of later that year at Gettysburg. Now, how he did this, how he got from our lowest New Year's Day to arguably our proudest New Year's Day, it's a great story. I hope I've given you that sense, but it is a story that takes 380 pages to tell. So I'll leave it at that. But I do want to talk just a minute about a question that I often got and still do get when I would talk about this book. It's the one that I think really nags at us as a country. It's a simple question: why? It's one thing to learn how he rose to greatness, but why did he fight this war? Why not let the South go? Why fight a war that cost, historians now believe, some 750,000 lives in a country of 30 million people? A war that decimated the Southern economy. By some estimates I read recently, it is only in our time, only in the past 20 years, that the South has returned to the level of wealth and prosperity that it had in 1860. It took him almost 150 years. And to tell that story, to answer that question, we have to go back even further than 1862, another 53 years to 1809, February 12th, a chilly Sunday in the remote hills of northern Kentucky, a little hut on a hillside. They call it a log cabin. That's a little glamorous. Really, it was a hut. There were logs filled together with mud. The entire space was less than 100 square feet. The room was smoky from this chimney that didn't draw very well. Abraham Lincoln's mother took her life in her hands by giving birth. There was no medical care. The stories are that the family sent for the old granny woman who lived about 10 miles away. She got there after the baby was born. He'd already been washed in water that was hauled from a dripping spring below the house, wrapped up in animal skins, and laid on a bed of dry husks over a mud floor. The point of telling that story is that though the calendar said 1809, the conditions into which Abraham Lincoln was born were no different than if he had been born 1,000 years earlier, or 10,000 years earlier for that matter. And as he grew up, he came to understand that the desperate poverty into which he was born had for thousands and thousands of years been a prison from which there was no escape. In all the societies that had been invented and created up until his day, to be born poor fated you to die poor. A few were born to be rich, and the rest were fated to be poor forever. But he had been born some 20 years after the creation of the United States, a nation founded on the ideal that all people were created equal and endowed with the right to make of themselves what they could, what one great Lincoln historian has called the right to rise in the world. He understood that this idea was the key to the prison of poverty. And as he grew, he came to understand that the opposite system that did exist in the United States, the slave system, which fated a few to be wealthy forever and many more to be poor forever, was a complete repudiation of the ideals of the Declaration. He understood that until this issue was resolved, the United States could not be what it might possibly be, that a house divided against itself, as he said famously, couldn't and wouldn't stand. And he, like a lot of people in 1862, understood something that we have forgotten. That if the South was successful in breaking away from the North, if secession as an ideal, a principle, was vindicated, there would be no end to it. The North-South divide was not the only divide in the United States then, or you might say now. Folks out here in the Midwest, their commercial ties were down the Mississippi River to New Orleans with the South. That's how they got their crops and their products to market. They had no interest and no affinity for the prigs of New England, as they thought of them. The people of New York, they were building New York City into one of the world's great financial hubs. How? By financing the cotton trade. Their interests were with the South. They were already talking about seceding from the North and setting up as a free port of New York. What about out in the West? These new states of California and Oregon, these treasure troves. They were connected to the Union in the East by wagon ruts. It was 1862, this same year, when the Transcontinental Railroad was authorized. But in those days, it was still a 3-month trip around Cape Horn to get from New York to San Francisco. They weren't tied to the Union. And they were talking about secession out there. What about the South? The Confederacy was no more stable than the North was. I mean, they had Texas in the Confederacy. Texas has always wanted to be its own country. Then, now, and forever. What Lincoln saw was that if the South was able to secede, that the fate of this dream of a peaceful nation from sea to shining sea, of the opportunity to rise in the world, this key to the prison of poverty, would be fated to break up into another version of Europe, a little kingdom here, a principality there, a democracy over here, a republic there, constantly fighting, constantly in competition, constantly at war. And so at the end of 1862, as November turned to December, Lincoln was trying to hold his party together after a difficult off-year election. He had the largest Native American uprising in our history, blazing away in Minnesota. He was worried about the Union Army being led in a coup when he had decided to finally to fire McClellan. He had these terrible battles piling up one on top of another. The front pages of the newspapers filled with lists of the dead. With all this going on, he locked himself in his office for most of a week to prepare his annual message to Congress. It's a strange document. I participated in an argument not long ago with a number of Lincoln scholars, and they were using words like bizarre, deranged, inexplicable. I finally had to speak up for this document. It is strange. No other president could possibly have produced it. But it was Lincoln's explanation to the American people of why they had to do this and what was in it for the country. He was this man on the tightrope crossing over Niagara, but he asked people to look at the other side. Where were they going? He talked about the geography of North America, how it was perfectly set up for one country and not well designed for more than one. He talked about the demography of the United States, the rate at which it was growing and renewing itself, attracting talent and hard work from all around the world. He talked about the natural resources that had been discovered on this continent, the richest breadbasket in the world, these gold and silver mines, these vast timber forests. And he said, look with me out 70 years. It's an amazing thing. I don't know of any other president who has done this. He's not talking about what he wants to do this year or this term or in his next term or for the children. He's saying, look out 70 years. If we can hold this country together, if we can get through this trial, if we can wage the hard, desperate fight, as he said, that it will require to win this struggle. In 70 years, the United States can be more prosperous than all of Europe put together. An extraordinary thing to say at a time when the sun never set on the British Empire, when the French Empire extended from Asia to Latin America, when Belgium controlled much of Africa, when Portugal and Spain still had their remnant empires, when the Russian Empire was seen as one of the great rising forces of the world. The idea that this one country could be richer, more successful, more powerful, more prosperous than all of Europe put together. And guess what? He missed by about 10 years. An extraordinary visionary moment. He said, we shall nobly win or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. That's why he fought the Civil War. That's why we venerate him now, if we do, as our greatest president. And that's why that vision, along with his many other skills, his great political cunning, his great patience, his great imperviousness to criticism, his great ability to learn. But this vision is why he is our greatest president. I thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to have your questions.